So now we will start the second part of our day of work regarding EU and its neighbourhood. And this part will be devoted to Brexit and EU FTAs. Of course, Brexit has become a huge topic for EU law in the last 2.5 years. It has opened a huge amount of legal and, of course, political uncertainties. And there is probably no subject for which the impact of Brexit should not be analysed. It may be quite strange or odd to devote a session to Brexit in a conference whose general topic is EU FTAs and its neighbourhood. But we have to bear in mind that whatever the modalities of Brexit will be, United Kingdom will undoubtedly be a neighbour country once Brexit has occurred. So it makes sense to anticipate a little bit and to analyse the impact of Brexit on several matters. Many papers have been written in the last 2 years on Brexit and external action, especially the question of the future relationship between the UK and the European Union. So in order to determine what kind of neighbour United Kingdom will be after he leave the European Union. And we will, of course, address this question during our panel this afternoon. But we would like also to raise other issues. You don't hear me very well, or maybe I speak without. You can hear me if I speak like that, without microphone?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much, Isabel.
Okay. So we'll also raise another kind of issues regarding the impact of Brexit, and this is the impact of Brexit of the rest of the external action of the European Union. So the session we will have this afternoon is twofold. First, we will hear a keynote speech by Professor Christophe Hillion, and then we'll have a round table with Christophe Hillion, Benjamin Sulger-Guichard, and Trudy Hartzenberg. First of all, I'm very pleased to welcome Christophe Hillion for its keynote speech. And I'm pleased, I would say, for two main reasons. First of all, because Professor Hillion is one of the best specialists in external relations law. He's professor at the universities of Oslo and Leiden. He's well known from our students. He wrote many books and articles on external action in general and on the subject of Brexit and external action. I think this is a topic which brings you very often in France these days. And the second reason why I'm very pleased to welcome Christophe is because he's a former student of this faculty and of this program of European law, and I know he will have some kind of emotion to speak in this scene. So thank you very much, Christophe, for having accepted our invitation, and I think you will stress Brexit and external action on a quite general approach, showing that it may have damages for the EU, but also kind of, how do you say that, kind of dividends for the EU. And then after Professor Hillion's speech, we will have a discussion focused on Brexit and EU FTAs in order to scrutinize if and how Brexit may have an impact on the existing and on the future relationship of the European Union with third countries. And we will focus on FTAs, not only the existing agreement that already applies, sometimes provisionally applies, but also the ongoing negotiations with third countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and some in South America. And we thought that would be interesting to have the different perspectives. So this perspective of one member state, France, and the perspective of a third state. So let me just introduce the two panelists. First of all, we'll hear Trudy Hartzenberg. She's executive director of the Trade Law Center, the TRALAC, which is a research center in Cape Town in South Africa. Trudy is specialized in international law and economics, and we are very happy to have you here, Trudy, to share your thoughts about Brexit and the implementation of the SADC-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, and especially the impact of the Brexit for South Africa within the implementation of this particular agreement. And I think that when it comes to relations to United Kingdom, South Africa has probably a special opinion to share. And then we will have Benjamin Sulger-Guichard, who works for the French government at the Secrétariat Général des Affaires Européennes, where he's in charge with external relations of the EU, especially trade policy, development and institutional issues. And among the institutional issues, you deal with Brexit. And I must say that Benjamin is also a former student of the Faculty of Law. And,
I've just lost connection to you.
You lost connections? So I hope I can go on. So thank you both. Thank you both for having accepted our invitation. So I give the floor to Christophe for his keynote speech.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. Thank you also, Cécile, for the invitation to take part in this seminar. Frankly, I can hardly overstate how delighted I am to be here. As was alluded to by Isabelle in a very kind introduction, as I'm a former student from this honorable institution, and I haven't been back to the faculty basically since my student days. So it's a particular emotional moment as far as I'm concerned. Especially that when I think back about this time, I think of it as a fairly romantic time, both because, of course, I was 25 years younger, but also because the big issue at the time was the preparation of the big enlargement of the European Union. It was about the establishment of a new breed of partnerships between the European Union, its member states on the one hand, and countries from Eastern Europe on the other. So a fairly romantic and positive atmosphere about the whole European integration. Little did I know at the time that I would be coming to this faculty to give my first talk as a non-student about the withdrawal of a state from the European Union. And I don't know which one is more surprising, in English. So it's a very nice occasion to be here. And thank you again to Cécile and to Isabelle for having given me the opportunity to come. It's also very nice to meet people without whom I probably wouldn't be sitting in this chair. Catherine, Christine, you really did enormous amount in giving me the appetite to go into European legal studies. So thank you for that. And of course I have a particular thought for Jean Rau, who evidently played a huge role in this respect as well. Now, we agreed with Isabelle that I would be tackling this fairly broad subject, that is Brexit and the EU external action. And I have to say, I'm sorry to continue to be slightly emotional, I have to say that it's slightly intimidating, and for various reasons. The very first one is that, as Isabelle seems to insist, it has to be a keynote speech. And obviously when one has to give a keynote speech, it's always very, well, it raises some expectations. So it's a bit intimidating. But perhaps what I found even more intimidating as I went along in the preparation of this lecture, I discovered that the organizers have already published an quite an exhaustive and thorough analysis of the connections between Brexit and the external action. And towards the end of my reading of that particular article, I have to confess that I really scratched my head in order to figure out what kind of original contribution I could make after this very thorough analysis. The other intimidating part about the subject is that, and that will be my very first point, Brexit tends to be, and perhaps inherently is, an internal process. It's a domestic intra-EU process. That will be my very first point. The second point, however, and particularly having read that contribution in the Revue trimestrielle de droit européen of 2016, which I encourage everyone sitting in this room, or for those who haven't read it already, to read it because it's very insightful. This very paper indeed brings to light the many connections that there are between Brexit, even if it is an internal process, and the external action of the Union. But it is nevertheless discomforting too, because as much as some of these aspects have now been uncovered, what we're discovering is that many external aspects, a great deal of the external dimension of Brexit remains quite unknown. And indeed, both in academic terms and in practical terms, it's not as if the external dimension of Brexit has been subject to a lot of studies. So a lot of Brexit in external dimension will basically come out when Brexit will have taken place. So it's fairly intimidating because it's difficult to predict all the external dimensions, all the implications of Brexit for the external action of the Union. So forgive the rather selective and patchy kind of presentation I will give. I have decided to make obviously certain choices, and I will remain at a fairly general level. So having made the general arguments that Brexit remains fundamentally an internal process, I will then turn to two external dimensions, two external contributions of Brexit to the external action of the Union. I will start with one that is fairly negative under the title of an EU external action as a Brexit collateral damage, in which I will try to establish, using a couple of examples, that that Brexit potentially weakens the external action of the Union. And then I will try to move on to a more positive take on Brexit for the external action of the Union, where I will try and suggest that the EU could actually draw some dividends from Brexit when it comes not only from its own integration process, but particularly when it comes to the development of its own external action. I forgot, typical me, to start my clock. So let me begin with the very first point, which is withdrawal as primarily an intra-EU process. And it's not only based on reading the press on a daily basis. If you read the Brexit-related media coverage, the picture you get is essentially that it's a process involving the European Union and the UK. That somehow the rest of the world is not part of the Brexit process. It's essentially an internal process involving the EU and a member state. And indeed, Article 50 says as much. If you look at paragraph 2 of Article 50, it talks about a member state notifying the European Council of its intention to withdraw. And then it triggers a process, albeit with the EU only being obliged to undertake that process of negotiating the terms of the withdrawal of that member state from the EU. But essentially what the picture you get while reading, at least prima facie, the provisions of Article 50 is that it is a process between a member state willing to withdraw and the European Union's institutions. And indeed the following paragraph, Article 50, paragraph 3, tells us that as long as the country has not, the member state has not withdrawn, it remains a member state of the European Union. So in a way, the whole process of Article 50 is an internal process between the Union and a member state. That member state remains a member state until the moment you reach the end of Article 50, the procedure of Article 50. The other element which I would underline is that Article 50 has the very purpose to shielding the whole process of a withdrawal of a member state from the application of public international law. It is the very purpose of Article 50 to embed the process of withdrawal in EU law. So it's the canons of European Union law that apply to the process, which again involves institutions, rather than the international law dimension, which would have been the case if the Treaty of Lisbon had not introduced that particular specific procedure of withdrawal in the primary law of the Union. That the whole process is governed by EU law. EU constitutional law has been made quite clear or confirmed by the European Court of Justice in the recent Whitman judgment, in which, as you know, a Scottish court asked the European Court of Justice to determine whether a member state having triggered the procedure of Article 50 would be in a position to revoke the notification envisaged in paragraph 2 of that article. And there the court emphasized very much, contrary to the Advocate General, that the whole process is a process completely determined by European Union law, and if there are gaps in the process, these gaps have to be filled in by reference to European Union law, rather than by reference to public international law, as suggested by the Advocate General. So that's another element, in my view, which indicates that the whole process is an internal process. It's between the EU and a member state, which remains a member state until the very end of the process of Article 50, and Article 50 really embeds the whole process in the constitutional law of the European Union. The other element I would like to underline is that the purpose of Article 50, when you read Article 50, paragraph 2, is not to establish a new relationship between a state which is about to become a third state and the European Union. It is to establish the terms under which that member state that has triggered the procedure is going to leave the European Union. Admittedly, in the light of the framework for a future relationship, but that framework for a future relationship will be in its details and legally established once the withdrawing state has fully withdrawn from the European Union and has become a third state. And when you look at the implementation of Article 50, you see clearly that that negotiation is not really a negotiation. It's not the usual negotiation between the EU and any third country or international organization whereby you have a lot of give and take and you come to a compromise between the different interests at work in the process. In hindsight, the whole process of withdrawal as governed by Article 50 is pretty much a process whereby the European Union establishes the terms under which a member state leaves the European Union under a negotiated deal, to the effect that at the end of the process, the choice for the withdrawing state is between a negotiated, well, a deal as essentially proposed by the European Union, or no deal at all, with all the implications that ensue for that particular member state. In a way, one could make a parallel between the way in which Article 50 has been implemented in practice in terms of putting the European Union really in charge, and its institutions in charge of the process, and the way in which the EU has articulated the so-called pre-accession strategy, preparing candidate states to become member states. It's the EU that determines the terms under which a third state becomes a member state. To put it simplistically, but I think there's truth in it, in the context of Article 50, it's pretty much the European Union that determines the terms under which a state that has decided to withdraw will withdraw from the European Union. Of course, it's completely different when it comes to the future relationship, and that makes my point. Article 50 is about determining the terms under which a state is leaving the EU legal order. It's not about modifying the EU legal order in a sort of, in order to come to some kind of agreement where the position of the two parties are compromised. So either under EU terms or no deal at all, which to me again is an illustration of the fact that we're pretty much talking about an internal process. Even if, and I will come back to this, there is a reference in Article 50, paragraph 2, to an element of the treaty-making procedure of the EU treaty-making procedure of Article 218 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. So in short, what I'm trying to suggest, although I stand to be contested, of course, Brexit and the withdrawal process as based on Article 50 is not formally part of the external action of the European Union. It's predominantly an internal process. And yet, of course, and that I'm coming to the crux of this presentation, there are nevertheless some external, some international dimensions to the process of Brexit. Indeed, as I will try to suggest, Brexit and the whole process of withdrawal from the European Union is infused by all sorts of both institutional and substantive law elements that are so specific to the law of the EU's external action. Just to give you a couple of examples based on the text of Article 50. Article 50 is a process to transform a member state into a third state. So there is an obvious connection between Article 50 and the external dimension of the European Union. Again, it's a process whereby a state that has been a member of the European Union ceases to be a member or state of the European Union to become a third state with which potentially the EU will have, if the two partners so wish, a new relationship, which will be an external agreement. Also, Article 50 makes a direct reference, as I said, to the treaty-making procedure of Article 218, and as I will suggest a little bit later on, in practice, the elements, the procedural elements of Article 218 have been multiplied. It's not only the reference to Article 3 that is relevant in the practice, in the implementation of the withdrawal process, but many other elements of Article 218 have been used in practice in the process of negotiating the terms of the withdrawal agreement. And last but not least, textually again, if you look at Article 50, it is in the light of the framework of the future relationship that the terms of the withdrawal have to be articulated, have to be negotiated. So there is a textual reference to the future relationship, even if Article 50, formally speaking, is not meant to be the procedural framework to establish legally the future relationship. It is nevertheless in the context of Article 50 that this discussion has to take place, with a view to calibrating the terms of the withdrawal. And it makes a lot of sense, of course. If the parties want to remain within a customs union, then the parties will have to make sure that in the context of Article 50, the terms of the withdrawal do not entail the creation of tariffs which will apply when the country leaves the European Union, but will have to be almost immediately be taken out as soon as the future agreement that may involve the customs union enters into force. So there is a requirement of consistency with what comes out later on in terms of an external agreement. So textually, Article 50 suggests that even though withdrawal is an internal process, it's pretty much connected to the fact that a member state is becoming a third state, with which the Union will want to potentially have some external arrangements. And in this context, of course, it means that if you look at the list of objectives of the Union with respect to the rest of the world, these objectives play a role in designing the terms of the withdrawal of the withdrawing state. Which basically, if I can put it in a nutshell, the law of the European Union, if you put Article 50 in its broader constitutional context, requires the European Union to go for a soft Brexit and not for a hard Brexit. It's both the objectives of Article 21 of the Treaty on European Union that create that kind of pressure, but as I might suggest later on, it's also the terms of Article 8 of the Treaty on European Union that mandates the Union to establish a special relationship with neighbouring states that requires the Union to establish the terms of its withdrawal with that particular objective of Article 8 in mind. So, textually, legally, the procedure established by Article 50 is not only an internal, or does not envisage only an internal process, but connects the process to the external dimension of the European Union. But more generally and more practically, Brexit is not only internal, it does concern the rest of the world, and we will hear far more about the world's perspective on Brexit later on. But Brexit and withdrawal of a member state from the European Union specifically affects the way in which the European Union as an international actor relates to the rest of the world, both politically, and I will look at this in the next part, and legally, which will also be covered in the next part. What I mean is that the withdrawal of a state from the European Union potentially weakens the external action of the European Union. The external action of the European Union might become a potential collateral damage of the withdrawal of one of its member states. And as it will become apparent, not only is the EU's external action affected by the fact that one of its member states will no longer be covered by this external action, but it also triggers an interest by some third countries and potentially international organizations to ask for, if not a renegotiation, at least some discussion about the terms that these countries, the terms of the arrangement that these countries have with the European Union. In other words, Brexit impacts on the external action of the European Union legally, but it also creates potentially a demand on the side of third states and international organizations to revisit the current arrangement they have with the European Union as a result of the withdrawal of one of its member states. So Brexit definitely affects the European Union external action, potentially in negative terms, but in my last part, what I would like to demonstrate is that one can also see a silver lining in the sense that Brexit might contribute to the development of the external action of the Union, both institutionally and substantively. But let me first begin with the external action as a collateral damage, and I will essentially look at this from two angles. One is the practical political angle, the external action substantively being damaged as a result of a member state leaving, but also legally, because simply the EU has a fewer number of member states. So I will start first with the, sorry, I have to make sure you follow. Legally, the impact of the withdrawal on union law in general and the EU's external action in particular is not really articulated in Article 50. Article 50 says very much about the potential legal impact of the withdrawal of a member state from the EU legal order. What we know is essentially what Article 50 paragraph 3 says, namely that upon the entry into force of the withdrawal agreements that may have been negotiated, or alternatively after a 2-year time period, the treaties cease to apply. Right? That's essentially what we know about the impact of withdrawal on the application of union law. But the way in which it is formulated is, in my view, suggestive of a general principle, and that is that the substance of EU law is not going to be affected by withdrawal. Withdrawal, as per Article 50, I would submit, is essentially a process whereby, in terms of
the impact of withdrawal upon the application of union law is limited to the reduction of the geographical scope of application of union law. Withdrawal, in principle, should not entail more than a reduction of the scope of application of union law. It should not entail a renegotiation, a modification of the substance of the acquis. That's, in my view, what Article 50 textually suggests. It is also what the economy of Article 50 suggests. What I mean by this is the following. Article 50 in its paragraph 2 involves the institutions. When it comes to the negotiations of the terms of the withdrawal, we don't have an interstate arrangement, unlike the accession process, which formally at least involves the member states of the European Union and the candidate states. Formally speaking, under Article 49, paragraph 2, you have a negotiation among states. In the context of the withdrawal procedure, that is not the case. It is not a process leading to a modification of primary law. It is not an EU primary law making process. It is a process which, on the contrary, is subject to the obligations deriving from EU primary law. And what I mean by this more specifically is this. Given that the negotiation of the terms of the withdrawal are in the hands of EU institutions, starting with the Commission, but involving the consent of the European Parliament and a qualified majority voting by the Council, you immediately have to connect the procedural arrangement of Article 50 with the general institutional rules governing the functioning of the institutional framework of the Union as per Article 13. And Article 13 says two things which are important in this discussion. The first one is that it sets out the very purpose of the Union having an institutional framework. And what I mean by this is that this institutional framework shall, I quote, aim to promote the values of the Union, advance its objectives, serve its interest. And there, this institutional framework has to ensure the consistency, effectiveness, and continuity of the policies and actions of the Union. Consistency, effectiveness, and continuity. Article 50 does not introduce any kind of derogatory functioning of the institutional framework. It embeds the institutional framework in its normal functioning. So my point here is to say that the institutions involved in the process of withdrawal, in the process of negotiating the terms of withdrawal, do have to stick to the general framework established to Article 13, which means, in my view, that they have to protect the acquis communautaire, they have to protect the continuity of EU policies. In other words, I would contend that Article 50 does not mandate the institutions with the possibility to renegotiate the substance of EU law. Quite the opposite, I would argue that Article 50 mandates the institutions to operate in the classic, the normal function, the normal framework that is established by Article 13, paragraph 1, and also as defined by Article 13, paragraph 2, namely each institution has to act within the limits of its own powers and thus in compliance with the general requirements connected to the principle of the institutional balance. So if you connect Article 50 with Article 13, basically the institutions that negotiate the terms of the arrangement, or the terms of the withdrawal of a state that wants to leave, they have to protect the acquis and act in accordance with the basic canon of EU law. And that's what brings me to say that when it comes to the external action of the Union, the institutions will have to make sure that the terms of the withdrawal do guarantee the integrity of the external action acquis of the European Union. So that ultimately the way in which the external action of the Union is affected is, in principle, though there may be exceptions, but in principle it is limited to reducing the geographical scope of application of the external action acquis. In other words, the UK will no longer be covered, whereas in terms of substance, the perspective of the European Union is that the external action of the European Union should remain the same. The agreements with the rest of the world should not be modified in terms of their substance, it would only be modified in terms of their scope of application. And that is indeed the perspective, that is indeed the perspective that was taken by the European Council when it published its first set of orientations after the notification by the United Kingdom. As you can see on the screen, the European Council took the view that the implications of Brexit in terms of the external action of the European Union is that the external action, the external arrangements of the European Union will basically cease to apply to the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, from the withdrawal onwards, will no longer be covered by agreements concluded by the Union. No longer be covered by agreements concluded by the Union. There's no suggestion whatsoever that the external action of the Union in substance is going to be affected. It's just the UK that is no longer covered. Even if there is another paragraph which says a constructive dialogue with the UK on a possible common approach towards third countries, partners, international organization and convention concerned should be engaged. There is a realization that the rest of the world might not exactly see that in the same way. And indeed, we'll come back to that in a second. But again, the principle from an EU point of view is that the UK leaves, but EU law remains the same, at least in substantive and institutional terms. What I found striking is the sort of one-size-fits-all kind of approach that the EU took in this respect. Namely, we are not only talking about EU-only agreements, we are talking about all EU member state agreements. All mixed agreements are also covered by that particular approach. As if all mixed agreements were concluded by the EU and its member state by virtue of their membership, and not states in their own rights, which in the case of the UK is particularly interesting because there have been several agreements which cover the area of freedom, security and justice where the UK was not concluding that agreement, at least in relation to this part on the area of freedom, security and justice, as member state of the Union. I seem to remember that the agreement with the Philippines, which was contested before the European Court of Justice, referred to the UK not as a member state of the European Union for the purpose of the content of the agreement that was covered by the derogatory regime applicable to the UK. So it's quite interesting that the Union should have chosen this one-size-fits-all, namely EU-only agreement and EU mixed agreement would simply cease to apply to the UK the moment the UK withdraws, as if the UK would no longer be in a position to say, well, I have concluded this particular mixed agreement as state in my own rights, and I want to continue to be part of that agreement. From the viewpoint of the European Union, that should not be the case. The other elements which you find in the orientations and more recently in the withdrawal agreements, which I want to flag up, is the other bit in the legal regime, and that's the transitional period. The transitional period, if the withdrawal agreement is finally ratified by the UK, would entail that during the whole transition period that would come to an end at the end of December 2020, the UK would continue to be bound by all external agreements of the European Union, mixed and otherwise. Okay? So basically the UK would remain part of the scope of application of these agreements in terms of obligations. The whole question, of course, is whether the UK would also derive the same benefits from those agreements as if it were still a member state. Well, that obviously cannot depend only on the EU's choice. This pretty much depends on the way in which the third states involved in those agreements might react. And I could anticipate that some non-EU states might not necessarily react positively to the idea that they should continue to regard the UK as a member state for the purpose of the application of EU's external agreement during the transition period, and not only in terms of the UK being bound by these obligations, but also in terms of enjoying the benefits of being part of this external agreement. So if the agreement, the withdrawal agreement, enters into force, you would have a two-step impact on the external action of the Union. One step is pretty much the status quo ante. For the duration of the transition period, the UK remains bound. In terms of enjoying the benefit, it's not clear. It's pretty much dependent on the way in which the rest of the world will react. And then at the end of this transition period, the UK will formally no longer be covered by the external agreements of the Union. Now, I've been trying to figure out why the Union did not want to differentiate between EU agreement and EU mixed agreement. And I've been trying to figure out, particularly in the context of a study I did on the impact of Brexit for the EEA agreement. And the only answer I could come to is basically, I wouldn't say laziness, but I would rather say procedural economy. This one-size-fits-all approach of the European Union entitled the EU not to open each and every mixed agreement to figure out what kind of distribution of competence it entailed. Did it entail the participation of member state qua member state, or did it entail participation of states in their own rights? It didn't want either to open a case-by-case, a potential case-by-case approach, which could have been required given the fact that some of the agreements that are concluded by the EU includes their own exit clause, and that is typically the case of the EEA agreement. If you look at the EEA agreement, there is an exit clause which actually predated Article 50. Under Article 127, also of the EEA agreement, it is possible for each and every contracting party of the EEA agreement to withdraw from the agreement, and the procedure is pretty light. It's basically inspired by the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. The state or the contracting party in question simply has to notify at least 12 months in advance. Now, what is interesting is that this it's already 30 minutes. Can I just carry on a couple of minutes? Neither the UK nor any contracting party has mentioned Article 127 in the context of Brexit. So you have a specific clause in the EEA agreement whereby every contracting party, and that includes the member state, the preamble of the EEA agreement includes each and every member state of the European Union as contracting party. And Article 2 of the EEA agreement defined the contracting parties on the side of the Union as, at the time, the European Community or its member states, or the European Community and its member states, suggesting that there are areas of the EEA agreement that belongs to member states' competence as states in their own rights. But again, Article 127 was never triggered. And I suspect that on the EU side, the idea was that it was not necessary to look at each and every mixed agreement of the European Union to try and see whether it would need to be treated for what it is on a case-by-case basis. Basically, the principle that has been followed by the European Union has been, again, this geographical approach, which is possible in and which has been the approach eventually in the EEA context, there is a clause in the EEA context that defines the scope of application of the agreement, which refers on the EEA FTA side to the 3 FTA contracting parties, but on the EU side to the scope of application of the treaties, the founding treaties of the European Union. And so there was this suggestion that by leaving the European Union, the UK also leaves the scope of application of these agreements, including the EEA agreement. It will no longer be covered by the clause of Article 126, namely the scope of application of the EEA agreement on the EU side to the territories to which the treaty establishing the European Economic Community is applied. So the approach has been a geographical approach by default. But it's not as if this geographical scope of, or this geographical approach will always work. And we can come back to this in the course of the discussion, but in the context of the EEA agreement, simply relying on this geographical approach, so to speak, creates a great deal of legal uncertainty, which could have some ramifications in the application of EEA law post-Brexit. And that's particularly the case in the EEA agreement, given the very specific institutional and legal framework that it establishes with a court system and a system of surveillance, where legal certainty is really paramount when it comes to the scope of application of the agreement. But as I said, third states might not necessarily simply accept that general approach of the European Union. And for having worked a little bit on Russia in the past, I was wondering whether Russia, which is a signatory to the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement with the European Union, will just say amen to whatever is coming from Brussels and from London in the particular political climate between Russia and the UK. Will Russia simply accept that during the transitional period the UK continues to be part of the scope of application of the PCA, to the effect that the Russian authorities will have to accept the British goods as if they were still covered by the Partnership and Cooperation Agreement? What if they refuse? The EU's geographical approach takes it for granted that it's only a matter of information of the rest of the world, and the rest of the world just has to accept the EU's approach. But I would not be surprised if a country like Russia, and we'll hear about other examples, simply say, well, sorry, I don't accept. The UK is out of the European Union. You may have agreed under the withdrawal agreement between yourselves that the UK continues to be part of the scope of application of EU law, but as far as I'm concerned, as a third state, I don't want to respect that. The scope of application of the PCA does no longer cover the UK. The same was true after the end of the transitional period, if there is one. Russia could demand some compensation the way it demanded some compensation when the EU enlarged to countries from Central and Eastern Europe, drawing from the law of the WTO, even if Russia at the time was not a member of the WTO. Russia managed to get some compensation from the EU as a result of its enlargement to countries from Central and Eastern Europe. So what I'm saying is that the EU has established a particular approach in terms of the impact that Brexit could have on its external action, based on the preservation of the acquis and based on the notion that what is happening here is essentially a reduction of the geographical scope of application of the treaty, albeit with certain arrangements or certain modification during the transitional period, expected essentially the rest of the world to accept that this internal deal between a member state, still the UK and the EU, would have implications for third countries. From a public international law point of view, this is quite dubious, actually. So again, we will see when Brexit becomes a reality, what kind of real practical implications Brexit has on the external arrangement of the European Union. I just wanted perhaps to finish on this part to flag up perhaps more tangible effect of the of Brexit on the external action of the Union, despite the efforts by the European Union to limit the effect of Brexit on the substance of the Union's external action. Well, to cut the story short, basically, with the UK leaving the European Union, the EUs will be losing a degree of influence, a degree of competence in several ways. The UK is not the smallest of member states. As we know, the UK, despite the chaos of today's political scene, the UK remains a big diplomatic power, a big power when it comes to security and defense. We'll see about trade. But it is definitely a loss for the EU's external action, politically and practically, to see the UK leaving. And so the EU will have to try and compensate for this loss in terms of international clout, not only with respect to the CFSP and the CSDP. With 60 million EU citizens no longer be consumers within the EU internal market, of course the EU as a market becomes slightly less interesting for big international partners than what it is today as a union, as a market covering 28 member states, including the UK, which is a big economy for the European Union, to say the least. And various third states have already indicated that, of course, the trade terms that they have with the European Union 28 cannot be the same once the European Union becomes EU 27. I remember having read Singapore wondering whether they should actually sign and conclude an agreement with the European Union under the terms the agreement was negotiated, given the fact that one of the reasons why Singapore wanted to conclude that agreement was to have access to the financial services of the city. Now, with the UK leaving, this access to the city financial markets through an EU agreement is put in doubt. So it could very well be that the Union may encounter certain problems in pursuing its approach, which is, as I said before, an approach which is based simply on non-affectation of the EU's external action, but simply in a geographical sense. And of course, institutionally too. Various mixed arrangements, including mixed membership of the Union in international organizations, involve a number of votes for the Union that is based on the number of member states that it contains. And that is the FAO, that is the Council of Europe several conventions. The EU will lose voting rights with one of its member states leaving. While legally and in terms of principles the EU tries as much as possible to contain the effect of Brexit on the substance of external action, there's no doubt that the UK leaving the European Union will affect negatively, potentially, the external action of the Union and the international clout of the Union in different domains, on trade, on foreign security and defense policy, just to name two, not to mention development cooperation, given the contribution of the UK to the EU's development cooperation. Again, here I'm referring to an extensive study of all this aspect in the 2016 RTDE article of the whole REN team. I'm coming to my last part, and the bridge to my last part is to say that one could say, well, at least with the UK leaving the European Union, a great deal of disagreement that is so far been internal to the European Union will be exported to the European Union. So the disagreements that the UK may have had with the EU institutions or with the member states of the EU institutions, and that may have hampered the external action of the Union when the UK was in, these agreements might be exported and might not affect the development of the external action of the Union. And as you will understand, I'm now coming to trying to establish that Brexit might actually bring some dividends not only for the UK. I'm referring here to the Brexit dividends that Theresa May has put forward in terms of allowing the UK to recover its full autonomy on the international plane and pursue a global Britain agenda, whereby the UK will be able to conclude almost instantly a great deal of external trade agreements with the big powerhouses of this world. Well, a couple of days ago, the press was quite vitriolic against Mr. Lyon Fox, the State Secretary in charge of international trade for the UK, on the grounds that there's and that's an understatement, a slight discrepancy between what he was promising when he took office as a new State Secretary for International Trade and what it has been to deliver in terms of establishing a new array of international agreements of the UK with the rest of the world. Of course, the UK was hampered by the fact that EU law prevented the UK from negotiating and concluding external agreements qua UK, but still as a member state. But even that, the rest of the world has not been particularly enthusiastic to start all sorts of informal negotiations with the UK as long as it was not clear that what the UK terms of its withdrawal with the European Union had not been settled with the EU. So I'm going to mention three types of dividends, if you like. The first one is in terms of decision-making process within the EU, including, generally, but also including when it comes to the decision-making process in the context of the external action of the Union. And here, I would simply submit that, first of all, with the UK leaving the European Union, there is potentially less bickering on the scope of the EU's external action, as well as the nature of the external action of the Union. If you look at the past, the UK has been probably one, if not the most active member state in terms of litigating against the EU institutions with respect to the choice of legal basis for external actions, as well as, and that's in connection to that, with respect to the nature of that external action. The UK has always been extremely scrupulous when it comes to the application of the principle of conferred powers and when it comes to the principle also of subsidiarity, which in turn has had a lot of expressions in terms of litigating before the European Court of Justice. Now, with the UK leaving, a hypothesis which will have to be tested once the UK has left is that there may be less bickering, less advocacy for mixity. The UK has been a champion of mixed agreement. Less bickering as to the choice of legal basis in terms of looking for legal basis that would basically protect the role of member states in the design of the external action of the Union. Including by way of trying to circumscribe as much as possible the exclusive competence of the Union, by way of circumscribing as much as possible the ATR doctrine, for instance. So with the UK leaving, we'll have to wait and see, but with the UK leaving, it would be interesting to see whether there might be less bickering on all this potential bones of contention with respect to the external action of the Union. The other dividend is less related to the departure of the UK as such, but it's connected with the way in which Article 50 was implemented institutionally. What I mean is, and as I alluded to a bit earlier, what we've seen in practice is that the process of negotiations under Article 50 have not only involved paragraph 3 of Article 280, but have involved other aspects of the treaty-making procedure of the EU enshrined in Article 280. I think here of the process whereby the European Commission drafted a set of negotiating directives, although that's not part of paragraph 3. A committee involving representative of member states monitoring the way in which the Commission would negotiate. Again, another part of Article 18, not part of Article 18.3, but still imported in the way in which the negotiation took place. Not to mention, of course, the role of the European Commission. If you look at Article 50 in combination with 218 paragraph 3, it was not crystal clear that the negotiation would be in the hands only of the European Commission. Indeed, some suggested, and that the way in which the first moves of the Council were understood, some predicted that the Council would have a role to play in the negotiation of the withdrawal agreement. And that's why this senior Belgian diplomat was recruited as the head of the working group within the Council. There is really, at a particular moment in time, an indication that perhaps the Commission would not be alone if it would be involved at all. Another practice, an institutional development which took place and which, in my view, and that's essentially the point I'm trying to make, the practice of Article 50 in institutional terms might have some spillover effects. It may inspire other practices in the strict realm of the external relations of the European Union. And one which I found particularly interesting is the role of the European Parliament in exercising, I'm thinking of Christine here, who's been the one really following that. The European Parliament has exercised far more control on the Commission and Barnier in particular as a negotiator than it would more arbitrarily do with respect to the negotiation of external agreement. It's a practice which has been both the result of an attempt of the European Parliament to play a key role. Indeed, the nomination of a Brexit figurehead, Verhofstadt, was an attempt at a certain point to have a representative of the European Parliament in the negotiating team. It didn't work, but nevertheless the European Parliament started to have a role in scrutinizing the way in which the Commission, particularly the head of the negotiating team, negotiated the agreement. And indeed, Barnier himself really went out of his way to make sure that the European Parliament felt very much involved in ensuring some level of accountability of the negotiating team. And that was based on a decision by the heads of state or government in the almost immediate wake of the referendum. Remember, there were a couple of decisions or declarations that were made, not of the European Council as such, but of the 27 heads of state or government together with the President of the European Council and President of the European Commission, in which you had an annex with the procedural arrangements that supplemented Article 50's arrangement. And there I think you have an interesting list of arrangements where both the European Parliament, the Commission and the Council have a role which perhaps could be a source of inspiration for the future practices in the strict context of the development of the external action of the European Union. Time will tell whether that's the case. The last particular practice which I found really interesting is the tandem between the European Council, which really acted as an institution of the EU rather than the body of member states representing themselves. The European Council really acted in the interest of the Union. The reference to the Union's interest in the orientation of the European Council in this respect is very symptomatic of the European Council acting as an institution in tandem with the European Commission. And this is something which we have seen in the past in the context of enlargement. And I think that for comprehensive agreements in the future, the European Council might try and attempt to play a more active role alongside or perhaps above the European Commission. We'll see whether the European Commission plays ball with that, but it may have some spillover effect on the governance of the external action of the Union. The second dividend is at the level of the development, the substantive development of the external action. In policy terms, as I said, there will be a negative effect in terms of the unions losing a level of clout in CSDP, in trade, in development. But at the same time, if you look at what has happened, the perception since the referendum, the perception is it may not be attributable only to Brexit and the fact that the UK is leaving, but there have been major development, for instance, in the common foreign and security policy of the European Union. It's been suggested that the establishment of the headquarters, which the UK has always been adamant not to happen, that has taken place since the UK has decided to leave. PESCO has been established. The European Defence Fund has been established. And even the European Commission now is pushing. There was a communication that was published a few months ago whereby the European Commission is pushing for a more active CFSP of the European Union. So it would appear that the perception is that the UK leaving the European Union is basically unlocking the possibility for the EU and its member states to develop a more active CFSP, potentially to compensate for the loss of a big player like the UK. What I find particularly ironic, if you look at the official documents that the UK published with respect to its aspiration in terms of future relationship with the EU in the field of CFSP, the UK is a great supporter of the CFSP and the CSDP on its way out of the European Union, that is, it's ever been as a member state of the Union. Obviously, what the UK is after is trying to keep the benefit of membership in terms of access to the institutions of the CFSP while being a third state of the Union. The question mark is whether in other fields of external action of the Union there will also be some dividends. Will the trade policy be reorientated from a liberalization dominated trade agenda to a more sustainable development inspired trade policy? The question can be raised, given that it's always the UK has always been presented as the main champion of a very liberal, open trade, international trade policy of the European Union. So will the balancing between the liberalization agenda of the trade policy and the other objectives enshrined in Article 21 of the European Union Treaty be modified as a result of Brexit? And I will come to my conclusion. The last dividend, of course, I wanted to mention is a dividend with respect to one particular policy in particular, and that is the policy of the EU vis-à-vis its European neighbours. Obviously, as the UK leaves the European Union, a new relationship will have to be established, and the question is whether this particular new relationship will serve as a template for other agreements or other relationships that the EU has with other European neighbours. I've heard several times Icelanders and Norwegians basically thinking that the UK, given its bargaining power, is likely to have more clout and therefore more privileged access to the European Union than the EEA-EFTA states, and thus the EEA-EFTA states would try and free ride on this negotiation to try and get a better arrangement with the European Union. Or, conversely, will it introduce more differentiation in the neighbourhood policy of the European Union, potentially on the ground that, well, the EEA-EFTA states having the kind of intimate integration relationship with the European Union by participating in the internal market, they will have a more privileged access to the EU, including outside trade and economic matters, than the UK will ever have, given its red lines with respect to the single market and the customs union. And we see glimpses of that at the moment. There is, as we speak, a discussion between Norway and the European Union as respect the access of the 3 EFTA states to the European Defence Fund, which the Commission has specifically opened to the 3 EFTA states but not to the UK and other third states, or whether, as France seems to be suggesting at the moment, there will be no privileged treatment of those states like the EFTA states having EEA agreement compared to the UK, simply because the UK might be tempted to have an arrangement with the EU that resembles the EEA without being the EEA in order to get the same sort of privileges as the 3 FTA states. So, in a nutshell, the EU's external action is definitely going to be affected by Brexit, even if Article 50 establishes an intra-EU process. What I've been trying to suggest is that the jury's still out in terms of whether this, the way in which this external action is going to be affected is only negative, or whether it opens new opportunities for the European Union actually to develop its external action, both institutionally and substantively. Thank you for the extra half hour that you granted me for my presentation.
Thank you very much, Christophe, for this very, same time, comprehensive and very precise approach of Brexit and external action. I'm sure there will be a lot of comments and questions afterward, but I just would like first to give the floor to the panel, and maybe we can start with Trudy, if you agree. And Christophe mentioned, Christophe mentioned the reactions, and including the negative reactions third states may have, that could perhaps be quite different reaction as what the European Union expects. So maybe you can give us the position of South Africa, how South Africa does prepare itself to Brexit, and how, in your view, it impacts the implementation of the relationship between the European Union and South Africa, and in particular maybe in the context of the EU SADC agreement, because I think you worked a lot of these agreements. So, Trudy, if you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Isabel, and thank you very much for that really interesting and comprehensive keynote address. I've learned a lot. I'm not a lawyer, so I've certainly learned a great deal this afternoon. I think just as Isabel has indicated, South Africa is, together with the other 4 members of the Southern African Customs Union, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini, formerly known as Swaziland, as well as Mozambique. They are the parties to the Southern African Development Community Economic Partnership Agreement with the European Union and its member states. And this, from South Africa's perspective, replaces a previous free trade agreement that South Africa had with the European Union, the Trade and Development Cooperation Agreement, which came into force in 2000, but was replaced in 2016 when the SADC-EPA became provisionally implemented by the SADC-EPA. So it's a relationship from South Africa's perspective, which is complex, also, of course, because it belongs to a customs union with 4 very small other member states. So I think that's important to keep in mind. It is also important to keep in mind from South Africa's perspective that our trade with the United Kingdom is very important. Our trade with the European Union as a whole, the EU is still the largest trading partner as a bloc for South Africa. United Kingdom, in terms of the EU members, is second after Germany, so it is a very important trading partner. And we have therefore been having a lot of discussions with the United Kingdom to take a look at a post-Brexit dispensation. And there have been various discussions, but as we speak right now, not very far from where I'm sitting, all the member states of SACU and the negotiators from the United Kingdom are actually meeting to discuss a post-Brexit continuity agreement. It's extremely interesting to keep in mind that the SADC-EPA is a free trade agreement, but a trade in goods agreement only. So it does not cover services or other new generation trade issues. And I think a particularly important point that our keynote speaker mentioned related to sustainable development and development provisions. There are, of course, a number of very important development provisions in the SADC-EPA. When we take a look at the agenda that is being discussed in terms of a future agreement with the United Kingdom, there are no development provisions on the agenda. I think that's extremely important to keep in mind. We are informed by the UK negotiators that development assistance, provisions, sustainable development support will be discussed separately. So that will not form part of the continuity agreement. I think just to keep in mind that the United Kingdom has recently signed a continuity agreement with Chile, with Switzerland, and a group of countries in East and Southern Africa. So we are on a priority list, it seems, to negotiate the continuity agreement. As far as the actual provisions that are very important for South Africa are concerned, we have to keep in mind that all the SADC-EPA member states except South Africa enjoy duty-free, quota-free access to the European Union under that agreement. And this will be on the agenda in the continuity agreement. But for South Africa, we do not enjoy duty-free, quota-free access. We enjoy considerably better access than we had under the Trade and Development Cooperation Agreement. But, for example, there are a number of tariff rate quotas related to agricultural products, and a very important one for South Africa is wine exports, and that's also the region where I come from, so that's extremely important. So from South Africa's perspective, this is an extremely important partnership, both in terms of our European linkages, trade, development, and investment relationship with the European Union, but at the same time, it is also important for us to negotiate a good deal post-Brexit. Very important, therefore, is what happens in terms of the new relationship between the UK and the EU, and whether, in fact, the United Kingdom leaves the customs union. That really is a critical point, because the agreement that we have, the SADC Economic Partnership Agreement, does not cover services or any other new generation issues. The common market related issues in the discussion between the UK and the EU are less important directly for us. Not irrelevant entirely, but less important in terms of negotiating a new agreement. So what we do have to look at then in particular is, as far as the discussions currently are concerned, we're calling them discussions because technically we can't be negotiating with the United Kingdom because it has not left the European Union. But the agenda is very much focused on a number of issues which are very important for South Africa. So it is tariffs in terms of market access to the United Kingdom. It is a very important destination for agricultural exports from South Africa, but also for some mining and other primary commodities. So it is a very important one. The tariff rate quotas are very important. I understand that what our negotiators, let's call them that in this context, are discussing is that South Africa would like to improve its market access for wine exports. This is a very important, the most important agricultural export. So instead of taking a look at the tariff rate quota in the SADC-EPA and a pro rata allocation based on historical trade, we are looking to get better access than that, and it seems that is fairly promising. There are also extremely important issues related to the safeguard provisions. And the safeguard provisions in the SADC-EPA are particularly important. There are 5 different safeguards provided for. The WTO safeguards are included, but there are safeguards for special agricultural safeguards, special safeguards for infant industry protection for the smaller countries, not for South Africa. So those are extremely important because we have to look at, for example, the trigger levels to activate those safeguards. So there's a lot of technical discussion, as we understand at the moment, as far as that is concerned. Another very important provision in the SADC Economic Partnership Agreement is the regional MFN clause. And that MFN clause applies to the large trading partners of the Southern African states. So it would include, for example, China, the United States, India, and so on. But it does not apply to our other African trading partners. So we are looking to see how this regional MFN clause is going to be formulated in the context of the continuity agreement with the United Kingdom. But this will also be, if we turn for a minute to what about a future relationship with the European Union, are we perhaps looking to renegotiate, to revisit some of the provisions in the SADC EPA? And the regional MFN clause certainly may be one of those, because the United Kingdom is a large trading partner. So depending on what we negotiate in the continuity and the subsequent agreement with the United Kingdom, that may have implications for the European Union and our relationship under the EPA. From the European Union's perspective as well, the tariff rate quotas are very important, because if we just take wine as an example, South Africa can export currently 110 million litres of wine duty-free to the European Union as a whole. About 32% of that last year went to the United Kingdom. So will the European Union member states still be prepared to accept the full tariff rate quota of 110 million litres? I think this is a question that some wine producing states within the European Union would certainly like to see as far as the discussion is concerned. The plan at this stage with the continuity agreement, because of course the timelines are so very short, is that the Ministers of Trade will be meeting via video conference link on Tuesday, this coming week, and the aim is to sign an agreement. The ministers will sign an agreement, that is the plan at this stage, next Thursday, the 21st of February. The agreement will then be scrubbed, and the aim is they will initial the agreement next Thursday and sign on the 8th of March. So in between the 21st of February and the 8th of March, the legal scrubbing will take place. And then, of course, is the process of ratification, of taking the agreement through the parliamentary processes in all of the member states, certainly on our side and also in the European Union. So the question really is, will we have all of this in place by the 29th of March? So this is a little bit of the discussion at the moment and some of the activity that is taking place. Alongside these negotiations between the United Kingdom and the SADC EPA member states that are taking place in Cape Town right now, next week there's also a meeting of the Trade and Development Council, which is an institution of the SADC Economic Partnership Agreement. And there are a number of very important issues on that agenda. So in the context of the current EPA regime, some of the safeguard issues, for example, related to a safeguard that South Africa and the SADC member states have imposed on the import of chickens from the European Union, is on that agenda. So there are some very important issues that are taking place alongside the negotiations with the United Kingdom, also taking place as we speak in the next week. So I think I'll stop there. Very happy to discuss some questions with you. Thank you, Isabel.
Thank you, Trudy. Thank you very much. Maybe we can come later to your different points and comments on aspect you mentioned, but maybe I will give the floor to Benjamin for explaining a little bit the position of the French government on Brexit and external action and the implementation of free trade agreements. So Benjamin,
regarding the position of the French authorities on Brexit and the FTAs, the EU's FTAs, maybe first of all a few comments on the transitional period. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I understand that there can be some debate about legal debate about whether the UK should continue to be a member to the mixed agreement of the EU or not. And I'm myself a lawyer, so I can understand the debate, but I will stick to the position, the official position of the French authorities and of the Council, and assume that the UK will indeed leave the mixed agreements of the EU after its withdrawal. But it is true that during the transitional period, because it will have to apply the whole EU acquis during 2 or more years, it will also have to apply the obligations stemming from international agreements, including mixed agreements. And indeed, there is a question whether third states, trade partners, will indeed allow the UK to benefit from trade agreements vis-à-vis third countries. And to settle this question, the Commission intends to notify the other parties to the international agreement that during this transitional period, the UK would have to be treated as like a member state of the EU. I think it raised a lot of questions. First of all, would the UK be invited to participate in the work of the joint committees under this kind of agreements? From my point of view, no, because it will not be a member state anymore. And there is also, of course, the risk of an objection by third countries that might consider that the UK shouldn't be part to this agreement anymore. And so the UK would find indeed itself in a situation where it has to implement the obligations stemming from these agreements without benefiting from these agreements in return. But I think that this specific matter is not for the EU to settle because it was clearly said that the EU shouldn't pay for the departure of the UK. We referred to possible compensations during your speech. So yes, I think in the current context, I don't see any reason why the EU should basically pay for the departure of the UK from the EU. And I would say also that at the end of the day, the Council also recognized the capacity for the UK to negotiate its own agreements, and also maybe after a special authorization to apply these kind of agreements, even if they fall under the exclusive competences of the EU. So I think the UK would have some kind of issue there. And at the end, I think I might be a bit more optimistic on this specific situation. I think it will be in the interest of both the EU, the UK, and first states to continue to apply during the transitional periods the whole set of agreements because of previsibility. And the Commission is also very optimistic on this issue. So for the transitional period, maybe then a word also on the impact of Brexit on the implementation of current existing agreements. As you said, from the EU side, the Brexit will reduce the territorial scope of application of the FTAs. This means that the EU's market size will decrease as a consequence. And therefore, the EU's partners could indeed argue that we should reopen this kind of agreements, like CETA, for instance, because their export opportunities to the EU have decreased. However, in my opinion, and this is my personal opinion. This would create too much instability in the application of these agreements, and I also believe that allegedly, if the EU becomes less attractive as a market, it also becomes a smaller supplier. So we can argue that there is a kind of balance that is restored in the equilibrium of obligations. Operationally also, it means that the integration of value chain in the EU will be affected. Basically, in order to, you all know that, but in order to benefit from a trade agreement, from trade preferences, you have to demonstrate that you comply with the rules of origin in these agreements. And if there is a company that exports using these preferences but produces both in the EU and the UK, after Brexit, the content made in the UK won't be considered as originating from the UK anymore. So this is a situation for EU exporters, but also for third state exporters, if they want to benefit from the accumulation of rules of origin with the EU. Last but not least, also on the application of current agreements, I would like to say a few words about the WTO system, because you know when the UK will leave the EU, it will also have to notify to the WTO its own commitments, its own schedule of commitments to this multilateral organization, and also to accede to some plurilateral agreement like the public market agreement. But regarding the notification of the schedule on goods, in this context, the EU and the UK decided to deconsolidate what we call the EU schedule on the TRQs, on the quotas, the volume quotas notified by the EU to the WTO, because these quantities were foreseen for EU 28 market and not for 27 plus 1. It means, for instance, that the Hilton beef quota of 58,000 tons was granted to by the EU to the WTO members, was calibrated for the 28 member states and not for the 27. So therefore, a common method was agreed at the end of 2017. And the idea between this method is to share the tariff rate quotas between the EU and the UK using a representative period, the use of this quota during a representative period. And so the consultations are ongoing at the WTO level. So this is a file ongoing. And maybe a few words on the impact of Brexit on ongoing negotiations and on future negotiations. I think the biggest issue with Brexit on ongoing negotiations is the uncertainty about the process. Because if I put myself in the place of our trade partners, basically they don't know if they negotiate with a market of 500 million consumers or less. And it implies a lot, because with Brexit the volume of the market will change, but also the shape of this market. For instance, if you look at the trade negotiations with New Zealand, the first biggest offensive interest of New Zealand is sheep meat. And if you look at flows between the EU and New Zealand, the UK is the first market of New Zealand in the EU. So a deal between the EU 27 and New Zealand can compare to a deal between EU 28 and New Zealand. Regarding future trade policy, I think there is also an issue on how the UK will behave as an independent trade partner if it has its own capacity to conclude trade deals. I think it will be able to compete with the EU on third markets, including, for instance, by increasing its competitiveness by adopting more relaxed legislations on I don't know, environmental protection, labor protection, making its product more competitive on third state markets. I think it could also compete with, I would say, the specificities of the EU, that the EU defends in its trade policy. For instance, the protection of GIs, geographical indications, GMOs, the precautionary principle. This is issues where we are very isolated on the international scene. And if the UK would, I don't know, tweak its legislation to maybe balance its legislation towards a more US approach on these matters, then there would be definitely more pressure on the EU to give up these rules, which nevertheless correspond to European collective preferences. So I think this is an issue. I think on the question that was raised by Christophe Illion on the future of trade policy, the EU trade policy, whether it will become a more trade and sustainable development policy or remain or stay a more liberalized policy. I invite you to read the Plan d'Action CETA by the French authorities, which has a very high agenda with a lot of ambition on trade and sustainable development. And indeed, I think that France will indeed gain a new weight at the Council because of the rules on qualified majority voting. But I think after all, the agenda of the trade policy agenda of the EU will indeed depend a lot on the result of the parliamentary election of this year and on the agenda of the new Commission. And last, about maybe the future relationship between the UK and the EU. I think it can also have a huge impact on the EU trade policy and the UK's trade policy. Because if the UK decided to establish a customs union with the EU, like it is foreseen in the withdrawal agreement, in the backstop protocol, then it would have to apply the EU's external tariff, the tariff preferences offered by the EU under its FTAs, the EU's GSP, and the EU's trade measures. So it will only be able to negotiate trade agreements to the extent that they comply with all these requirements and this tariff, and also on the services and public procurement things not dealt with the customs union. Regarding the position of the EU and of France maybe on this situation, given the special nature of the relationship between the EU and the UK in this case, I believe that member states should not accept this customs union without guarantees, special guarantees on its implementation. Turkey is an example of a country where we have customs union and where the commitments from Turkey are not always met, I would say. So I guess this situation will need I think the EU should be able to sanction immediately on a very targeted basis any infringement of its trade policy by the UK. And also, I think if we go to this special, this kind of deep relationship between the UK and the EU also should seek very tough commitments by the UK on the issue of level playing field. I think this is some kind of motto for the French authorities now on Brexit, but it's very important because without this kind of safeguards, the EU would find itself in a situation where we offer a very deep market access to the UK without, how can I say that? But at the same time, we would suffer from unfair competition because of regulatory divergence on for instance, environmental standards, state aid, or taxation law. Voilà.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Benjamin. I think we've lost really once again. I hope she will come back so we can ask some questions. Maybe you have some reactions, so I would like to open the discussion with the audience. If you have some questions for the two panelists who are still here. I just recall you can ask your question in French, of course, and we will translate it if it's needed for Trudy. So, do you have questions or remarks? Yes?
Yeah, my question is about something you say that maybe some countries would like to reopen negotiation with the European Union because of the UK leaving, and I was asking myself if it could be used by some states that are concluded free trade agreements on mixed agreements particularly, to use the fact that they are negotiating this agreement when the UK was part of the European Union and was part of the agreement, and use this to try to denounce the agreement as it would not be what they agreed for, because they agreed to be part of an agreement with the UK, and use this potential denunciation to try to gain some leverage in new negotiation, or try to get something more or new deals from the Union.
I think it's a very interesting question. Maybe legally they could find some ways to do so, but I think politically it's not in the interest of the EU or of its partners to withdraw from an agreement. And I can think of I'm checking, but I can think of any partner that would adopt this kind of behavior on trade issues. I think our trade partners find more difficult to conclude deals with the EU, with our specific negotiation and conclusion scheme in the EU. So that's a great deal for them. So I wouldn't say that they would like to withdraw from trade agreements with the EU.
Trudy, do you want to react or?
I missed a little bit of the discussion, but I think the question about whether partners would want to renegotiate with the European Union is certainly an important issue, just as it is the other way around. In the case of the SADC Economic Partnership Agreement, we can foresee that the European Union may come to renegotiate specific provisions, and the tariff rate quotas is certainly one of those, because the United Kingdom has been taking, particularly from South Africa's exports, a very large proportion of the goods that we trade under the tariff rate quotas. And the provisions on safeguards, I think, are equally important in terms of the specific application, the trigger levels, and so on. So again, because in a sense the size of the partnership agreement has been reduced or will be reduced by the size of the United Kingdom, that means that there certainly are issues that we do need to have a look at again. And as I mentioned, the regional MFN clause, I think this is a really important one. But I think we've also just mentioned the rules of origin and accumulation. Now, one of the issues that the United Kingdom is raising in its discussions with us at the moment in the continuity agreement is that they would like to be able to accumulate fully with the European Union indefinitely. And that's a recognition from their side that their value chains are very much linked to the European Union, to the common market, which is very important for them. So they would like to continue to benefit from that. But the question then is, what would be not only the perspective from the SADC negotiating partners, but also from the European Union on issues such as this. So I think that it's really a very good question, because there are so many very important issues which are specific to the agreements between the European Union, 28 members, with the United Kingdom being quite a large trading partner, particularly for developing countries, and certainly for African countries. And and from our perspective as African countries, the European Union remains extremely important. But for those that have a historical relationship with the United Kingdom, as South Africa does, the United Kingdom market is also important. So we really have to look at all sides of that equation when we take a look at future relationships, and certainly look at also our future relationship with the European Union.
Yeah, Trudy, if you're still here,
Yes.
thank you very much for your intervention. I had a question about what you said regarding the continuity agreement between the UK and was it South Africa, where you said that the UK was quite keen on not having any provisions on development cooperation included in that new agreement. Keeping the development dimension for a different instrument. How do you read that? Is this an indication that the UK as a development cooperation actor is likely less to be engaged in development policy, or is just technically it was a more convenient way of doing it?
And I think this is something that we're talking about quite a lot at the moment. I think there are a number of issues. What is very clear is that we have to recognize that the United Kingdom, the Department of International Trade, has very little negotiating experience. So it appears to us from the discussions we're having is that they have what we might call a template agreement. And it's a very focused agreement, focusing on trade in goods, a very traditional free trade agreement with none of the development related provisions which we see in a partnership agreement. So this is very much a traditional free trade agreement, and there's very little scope for negotiation. So it seems that the negotiating mandate of the negotiators who are participating at the moment for the United Kingdom is very, very limited. So I think that's what we've got to keep in mind. However, it has been made clear to us that there will be separate discussions as the United Kingdom takes a look at its development finance agency, its engagement in terms of development assistance, and that a new approach may be developed. So it's very difficult to say at this stage whether there would be less support. It may well be that the support is packaged differently. And so we really are waiting to see exactly what that will mean, because this does mean a very strong departure from the European Union approach of a comprehensive development partnership arrangement, such as the Economic Partnership Agreement. It is, of course, important to keep in mind that in the case of the Southern African Development Community, EPA, South Africa in particular did not want to negotiate services, investment and other trade-related issues. So from that perspective, it is limited to trade and goods, but it does include significant development assistance and support, which can be drawn down to support, for example, the development of quality infrastructure, and to support SPS compliance and so on, which is extremely important. It also has a number of institutions, the Trade and Development Committee, which is very, very important, because that actually has a mandate to consider proposals for amendments to the agreement. So it certainly is a much broader and a much I think, deeper partnership arrangement that we have under the EPA than what is being considered currently in the case of the United Kingdom.
What's the immediate effect of no deal Brexit on EU external relations? Just immediate. Do you see any?
No deal.
No deal, yeah.
Yeah, no deal Brexit.
Well, then you if I may,
Yeah, of course.
no transition, and that means that the provision of Article 50, paragraph 3 applies. The treaties, in a sense of EU law generally, including EU external agreements, would cease to apply to the UK. And so that means that on the 1st of April, I'm just speculating, but a Turkish national employed in the UK will no longer be able to rely on the Ankara agreement against his or her employer for being discriminated against. So it's not only the UK that might be confronted with a cliff edge. It's actually all businesses, individuals that are whose legal situation in the UK is currently governed by EU external agreements, will see their situation basically profoundly changed. And in the EEA context, it means that Norwegian students, Norwegian workers in the UK will no longer be covered by the EEA agreement. So the UK and Norway have scrambled to negotiate a parallel agreement to what the EU and the UK have negotiated, which is basically a copy-paste, which in my view is a violation of the EEA agreement because it introduces disharmony in the application of EEA law post-Brexit to those EEA citizens who are in the same situation as EU citizens having exercised their rights by going to the UK. That's another story. But strangely enough, the Council gave an authorization to the 3 FTA states to start negotiating with the UK on the basis of a very strange document. It was in a paragraph in the conclusion of the Council, basically allowing the 3 FTA states to start negotiating, allowing the UK to start negotiating with the FTA state. So for them, it will be slightly different because in principle, but strangely enough, the copy-paste of the withdrawal agreements that may not enter into force between the EU and the UK will enter into force between the UK and the 3 FTA states. And then the Norwegians might see their situation better protected than EU citizens in the UK. It's a long answer, but the principle is that the moment the UK leaves, unless there are arrangements between third states and the UK to replace the situation with something new, which has not been really possible legally because the Union in principle has prevented that from happening, except for the 3 FTA states, then businesses and individuals from third countries will no longer be covered. Conversely, UK citizens in states with which the EU has external agreements to govern the legal situation of EU citizens there, the UK citizens will no longer be covered. So a UK businessman in Turkey will no longer be covered by the Ankara agreement as of day one of Brexit. So that's what we're talking about.
Maybe to complete on the trade aspect, basically no deal scenario, then the relation between the EU and the UK will be settled by the WTO arrangement because the UK will remain a member of the WTO. So it means that the UK will lose its preferential access to the internal market, both for goods, services, investment. So we have basically UK exporters will have to pay the LFN tariff to access the new market, and also checks on goods and services will be reintroduced at the border, especially on agri-food products. So yes, basically that's what will happen.
Isn't that in itself a violation of WTO law? I mean, the whole idea of WTO law is that progressively you suppress tariffs. That's the whole dynamic of WTO, which is basically restricting dramatically the ability of WTO members to introduce tariffs. Brexit means introduction of tariffs between two trade partners. How does that fit under WTO?
But
I'm not a WTO law
it
specialist, as
means-
you can understand.
It means granting MFN treatment.
Yeah, but if the
Because-
MFN treatment is a reintroduction of tariff where the tariffs had been liberalized, isn't that going against the grain of the core principles of the WTO, which is always going in one direction, which is liberalization? That's the
Well, the other way one would be if we keep the zero tariff.
yeah, but
You
that's
have to apply the MFN clause and give it to the others.
Yes.
So
But that's why, I mean, again, I'm not a WTO law
Yeah.
specialist, but I've been trying to figure out whether there are any precedents whereby states that are split, I was thinking of Serbia and Montenegro, but it's not relevant because I think Serbia is still not a member of WTO. So I don't think there are many precedents of two members of the WTO reintroducing, because they have split, they used to be as one single entity and they split, to become two separate WTO members. That I'm not aware of any precedent whereby you can introduce tariffs where there were none.
well, the other thing is that when two territories split, sometimes they keep a customs union between one
Yes.
another. So
But
The
it's not on
problem
the
is
it's not on
not-
the book. I mean, it's not on the table now.
yeah, but what I mean is that I think you had a president with a Well, I'm not sure.
No, they were not
They were not
WTO members
WTO
either.
members either.
It was in
That's
'93.
right.
It was before the
Mhm.
WTO agreement.
But you could have this kind of solution, but that's not the no deal scenario, of course.
Exactly.
Isabel, if
Yeah, trade
if
treaty.
I may,
Yeah.
just a comment there. We know that although the United Kingdom is a member of the WTO in its own right, it does not have its own tariff schedule. So it has actually submitted a proposal, and member states are still in the process where they can respond to the proposal that has been made by the United Kingdom. But that process is not finalized yet. So some schedules were submitted in December, and there is a period of 45 days during which other member states can actually respond. But the timelines are not complete yet. So at this stage, we actually don't know what the UK's WTO schedules will be. So we don't know what the MFN fallback position actually is. It has to be negotiated with other member states, and we can well expect that there will be certain areas, particularly perhaps on agricultural products, where the UK does not have strong production capacity, where there are offensive interests from other WTO member states to negotiate better access than they might have at the moment. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the WTO, the MFN fallback position at this stage still.
Exactly. I've never been really convinced by this basic argument. Well, if there's no deal, there is this very comfortable WTO cushion waiting for us. We will land like a cat on our 4 feet. When the joint letter of the EU and the UK was sent to the WTO Secretariat at the end of 2017, and there were a presentation of the method that would be followed by the UK and the EU in the attribution or the distribution of the quota, particularly in agricultural products, there was an immediate reaction from the US, Australia, I think, and New Zealand, the three favorite trade partners that the UK wanted to, with which the UK wanted to have an agreement straight away. They basically said, sorry, we are not going to follow that method. That method is not applicable to us. And so I anticipate that there will be quite a lot of hiccups along the way, even if there is this alleged comfortable WTO cushion in case there is a no deal. I mean, the rest of the world will have to accept. It's not as if the UK and the EU just can impose their method on the WTO partners.
Maybe a comment on this. About the legality towards the WTO of the reintroduction of MFN tariff between the EU and the UK. In my opinion, there is no doubt that it is legal because the Union itself is an exception to the WTO MFN rule, and the fact that some members of the WTO decide to enter to form a customs union does not prevent them from forming this customs union. So I wouldn't have any doubt on the legality of this. And on the UK schedule to the WTO, indeed there are consultations ongoing. Some members of the WTO, like the US, Australia, Argentina, and some other countries, argue that their market access will be affected by the split of the quotas between the EU and the UK. The answer from the Commission and from the Member States is that at the end of the day, the quota, if you aggregate the quota, the EU 27 new quota and the UK's quota, you will have 100% of the previous quota. So their market access won't be affected. And in case there are too many consultations and debates at the WTO, the rules of the WTO allow a member of the WTO to unilaterally change its schedule and to enter in new consultations, but then it will be for the members of the WTO to prove that their market access is indeed affected. So that's why a regulation was adopted by the Council on last month to unilaterally notify a new schedule in case consultations can be settled before Brexit.
Other comments, remarks, questions? No? Yes? Oui, Marie, just a remark?
Further on that, maybe it has been already said, if it's the case, actually. But the UK would still be bound by the tariffs on the MFN that has the engagements of the European Union towards the WTO, and if UK wanted to protect a little bit more its market than the EU used to do, it would be a reintroduction of new tariffs, and it would be, I think, illegal under WTO rules. So the UK is still bound by the EU's tariffs.
Yeah, and the strategy of the UK with regards to its schedules at the WTO, both under the GATT and under the GATT, and also under the agreement on the TRIPS and the GPAs, is to copy-paste basically the tariff, the schedule regarding services, and the engagement with the reserves on public government procurement of the EU, in order to prove to third states that the market access is not changed at all. But as I said before, I think it is a matter for the UK to deal with, and not for the EU.
Okay, if you don't have any... Catherine, pardon.
Français. En fait, j'ai une question et puis une remarque. La question, c'est à propos du fait qu'on est en présence d'un processus interne qui exclut d'appliquer d'emblée l'article 218 dans son intégralité. On y fait référence ponctuellement, tu as dit. Et c'est à propos de la façon dont on pourrait voir les choses pour faire une demande de saisine de la Cour. Parce que la Cour ou le tribunal, je ne sais plus exactement, a quand même évoqué dans sa jurisprudence cette possibilité de saisir la Cour. Donc c'est vrai qu'on me se réfère pas à l'article 218, mais là, ça pourrait devenir une sorte de source d'inspiration pour donner sans doute une ampleur plus grande à cet article en lien avec l'article 50. Ça, c'est un peu ma question, ma position là-dessus. Et puis, la deuxième chose, c'est à propos des dividendes du point de vue du processus décisionnel, de certaines pratiques, etc. Je te trouve un peu optimiste, parce que, bon, on sait très bien que le Royaume-Uni, c'est quand même un bon alibi pour certains États qui revendiquent de la même manière des bases juridiques qui sont plus protectrices, la mixité, etc. C'est juste une petite remarque.
C'est vendredi soir, je me suis dit un peu de...
Fallait bien trouver quelque chose.
Oui.
Maybe in English?
I will answer in English. On the dividends, it's true. Lots of member states have been free riders and hide it behind the UK with the same positions. Yet, some question marks have been raised. For instance, in Sweden, they feel increasingly uncomfortable because they know that because they are a smaller member state, they will not be able to defend the same positions as the UK has defended in the past. So it's not only in the field of external relations. For instance, they are increasingly worried that they might not be able to stay for much longer outside a big debate as to whether they should enter the Eurozone. So there are discussions in Sweden, even if there's been a referendum, if not two, on the question. Now they're feeling, well, staying outside the Eurozone is becoming a bit more difficult. And more generally, derogatory treatment in the EU are becoming more difficult to sustain now that the biggest beneficiary, which is also a big member state, is leaving. And I extrapolated this to the field of external relations. I don't know whether Sweden, for instance, or the Czech Republic will be as active, also because they might not have the same level of human resources to play that role of litigator to challenge the Commission choice of legal basis. So I don't want to be too affirmative, but I think it changes somewhat the balance of power among the member states, between those that want to be more recalcitrant and those who might want to push for a more integrated approach. On Article 218, paragraph 11, I'm humbly of the view that it should have been used, and that it is usable in the context of Article 50, even if that contradicts completely my suggestion that it's an intra-EU process. But it's nevertheless an agreement whose implementation will then start at the level of public international law. I was talking about the process leading the notification to the conclusion of the withdrawal process. That's really internal. It includes a member state and the union's institutions. But ultimately, this is to conclude an agreement which will have, obviously, an existence on the public international law level. And the sort of justifications that the Court of Justice has articulated to justify the recourse to paragraph 11 of Article 218 are perfectly applicable to the kind of agreement that is negotiated and concluded in the context of Article 50. The other argument I would put to the table is that, as I suggested, while Article 50 only makes a punctual reference to one single paragraph, in practice, many other aspects of the treaty-making procedure as per Article 218 have been involved in the process. For instance, no choice to depart from the classic implementation of 218 when it comes to the choice of the negotiator, but mainly allowing that negotiator, namely the Commission, to propose negotiating directives. This is not foreseen in paragraph 3. These negotiating directives then were approved by the Council. Under paragraph 3, the Council can only decide on who is the negotiator. Once the Commission has asked for the negotiator, HR or Commission have asked for the authorization to open negotiation. But what we have seen in practice is that an element, I think, of another paragraph, which is about the negotiating directive, were drafted by the Commission. The Commission then got the approval by the Council. Again, there's also this special committee of Member State representatives. This is another paragraph of Article 218. So what I'm saying is that in practice, other elements of paragraph 218 have been brought in. So mutatis mutandis, why not apply the same kind of approach and include also the possibility to ask an opinion from the European Court of Justice? What if, down the line, once the agreement is implemented, you have someone in the EU asking about the validity of the decision to conclude this agreement? It's an EU act. The decision concluding the EU act by the Council could be challenged on the ground that perhaps some elements were incompatible with the treaty. The EU would then enter a very difficult terrain legally, both vis-à-vis the UK but vis-à-vis the rest of the world, which is exactly the sort of difficult legal situation that Article 218, paragraph 11 is deemed to prevent, according to the court's case law on this very procedure. So I think there are good grounds to allow the use of that particular procedure in relation to the agreement of Article 50.
If I may come back to the first point, so the first part of your answer, so the position of the member states. Can't we say that this is mainly a question of argument brought by the member states, much more than the position they defend? I mean, when it comes to exclusivity, for example, of the competence, the argument brought by the member states, maybe for the UK or some Northern Europe member states, the question of sovereignty, for example, it's more a question of principle to have a mixed agreement or to refuse exclusivity of the competence and to promote shared competence. But in a way, all members, when it comes to those questions, there are some shared position. The member states share the same position. I mean, they want to promote a shared competence and they want to deny exclusivity as much as possible. So I think I understand your point, what you said about Sweden, for example, but the question is not only the question of the position at the end. This is the question of the argument brought by the member states. You understand what I mean? And I think that's why I would share. I would agree with Catherine to say that I thought maybe, for example, with the FTA doctrine, it's exactly the same. I would agree with Catherine to say that we may be a little optimistic.
I was not coming with a definite prediction of where the future lies, but with respect to exclusivity. I was just trying to make the point that if there is one member state which both institutionally within the institutions, but also, I would say, in academic terms, has contributed the most to litigation and the whole doctrine of conferred powers and the choice of legal basis so as to preserve member state powers, that's probably the UK. It's the whole competence creep doctrine that started in the 90s and which ended up with the Maastricht Treaty, well, it was even before, with the Maastricht Treaty consolidating or codifying that notion of conferred powers. Before Maastricht, we didn't have that. And the Brits were so adamant. I do remember a long conversation with Alan Dashwood, the former director of the legal service of the council, and he was one of perhaps the most influential scholars in the UK about the restrictive approach to external competencies, both in terms of scope and in terms of the nature. So I wonder, it's a broad question, but I wonder to what extent some of the positions, some of the member states' positions in today's European Union with respect to the issue of competence with the issue of the nature of that competence is actually the result of a very active policy pursued by the UK on this terrain, which might not have been the case within the EU had the UK not played that role. I remember Marc Maresco telling me once that Alan Dash would revolutionize the law of EU external relations. And I think there's a point in that. He was one of the ones really pushing for a very restrictive understanding of the use of external competence, which led to Opinion 194. So I may draw too much from the UK, but I think the UK played an extremely influential role in the development of the doctrine of competence in the field of external relations. And we'll see whether this is followed suit. I'm perfectly willing to recognize that since then the EU has enlarged to states that have proven to be good friends of the UK when it comes to issues of competences. Again, think of the Czech Republic, Sweden, although Sweden has evolved dramatically. Sweden entered the European Union with just above 50% at the referendum, and the support is now much, much greater than it used to be. So Sweden would not necessarily be the best example, but countries like the Czech Republic and increasingly Poland will play this sort of proto-British card of control of competences. It's true. So I may be over-optimistic, and maybe this is not what is needed either. Perhaps mixed city is wonderful and everyone should support it. I haven't spoken about France, but I would be very interested to know the position of France when it comes to competence. I think it's a bit ambivalent, to say the least.
Okay, then I think we can end up our session here. So thank you very much for the participants in the round table. Thank you very much, Trudy. I hope the next time we will find a way to bring you here in Rennes. Thank you for.
I would love to do that.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the. Okay, so thank you very much, and I don't know when will be the next seminar session. End of
Not scheduled yet.
Not scheduled. So we will let you know.
Not totally scheduled, but somewhere in spring.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.